FBI headline, U.S. airstrikes increasing support for ISIS. Second, the airstrikes in Syria increasing support for ISIS in both Iraq and Syria. Oh, is that an amazing result? As a matter of fact, ask yourself, why the public beheading? Saudi Arabia doesn't put it on television for us when they behead people, as they do every month, one for sorcery recently. The Free Syrian Army doesn't put it on television when they behead people, as they've done 7 prisoners recently. Why did ISIS choose this moment to put on consecutive days, weeks or something, a public beheading? Well, as Nick Kristof suggests, and these CIA things and the FBI confirm, they want U.S. airstrikes. Now, how could they want U.S. airstrikes? Well, they kill a lot of Iraqis or Syrians, civilians, and others, and even when they kill ISIS. It shows that ISIS is leading the fight against the U.S. Nothing does it better. That's what these reports actually say. In other words, doing this something, military, easy, no U.S. casualties, over there in an airstrike, we are strengthening ISIS, is the FBI. So doing something that makes things worse is not something you should vote in support of, though that's what Kerry is asking us to do, finally. I'm sorry, no, I know I've gone too long, but Norman, I have to quote one last thing, I'm sorry, from my Vietnam experience. On April 6th, I remember that date actually, the day before my birthday, 34th birthday, I read in the Pentagon, this is in my earlier book, Papers on the War, from the Pentagon Papers. April 6th announced that the president had decided to change on April 1st, April Fool's Day, to change the mission of U.S. ground troops, initially the Marines, to include offensive ground operations. Now the Marines, I could go on forever, and I won't, in March had been sent there. My boss, I remember, said, oh my God, we're sending in the Marines. It's got to be anybody but the Marines. That means a commitment. I'm a former Marine. And he tried to make it the Army, but it was too late for the Marines. So we sent the Marines in, but with the announcement, just to defend Da Nang for its air operations. Air operations, you know, those simple, harmless things that don't get us committed. So the Marines are there to defend. That was the public announcement. He changed that to offensive ground operations. I remember getting the message on April 6th, secretly. And McGeorge Bundy, his national security assistant, predecessor to Henry Kissinger in this job, the president desires that premature publicity be avoided by all possible precautions. The actions themselves should be taken as rapidly as practicable, but in ways that should minimize any appearance of sudden changes in policy. They were going out from the base doing offensive patrols, now, the kind I was trained to do as a rifle company commander. The president's desire is that these movements and changes in combat mission should be understood as being gradual and wholly consistent with existing policy. And I wrote a memo at that time inside, as a Cold Warrior working on the war in Vietnam. I wrote a memo to my boss and said, this is dangerous. You can't keep that secret. There's reporters over there. They'll know what the Marines are doing and will be shown to be concealing it. You know, we've actually changed the whole nature of the war. We're taking over the war from the South Vietnamese. I don't think you can keep it a secret that long. I was wrong. That was April, May, June. 100,000 troops were over there now. Another 100,000 about to go. And they're on offensive operations, of course. No word, no leak that there's been. So on July 28th, when the president finally announced that we were sending more troops, and actually, since I'd written the earlier speech, it was 100,000, but he announced 50,000 to make it look a little more palatable. So he announced 50,000, and he was asked this question, Mr. President, does the fact, this is July 28th now, April, May, June, July, 4 months later, does the fact you are sending additional forces to Vietnam imply any change in the existing policy of relying mainly on the South Vietnamese to carry out offensive operations, your Syrians, Army, Iraqi? and using American forces to guard installations and to act as an emergency backup. President LBJ, it does not imply any change in policy whatever. It does not imply change of objective. And as I wrote, that was true. The policy had been changed 4 months earlier. They just hadn't announced it. I'll end with this question. When General Dempsey, as he has forecast, recommends that people be put, American troops, ground troops, be put not in battalion headquarters or brigade headquarters, but in the front lines, calling down air missions, and perhaps accompanying them on combat missions. When he makes that recommendation, will it be announced? And when the president accepts it, if he does, will we hear it? No. Why? Why would we? Because President Obama is less secretive than Lyndon Johnson or Nixon? Actually, he isn't. So when they say, in other words, this should be considered as a question of getting into war, deserves that kind of attention and debate and questions being answered, it deserves all that, and it will not happen without whistleblowers telling the truth that the generals are unwilling to pass on to Congress. The lack of whistleblowers in 1964 and 65, and I was part of that lack, caused us Vietnam. The lack of whistleblowers, the lack of an Edward Snowden or a Chelsea Manning in high levels in 2002 cost us Iraq. So what the meaning of this poster here about the don't do what I did, I'm talking about don't do what I did in 64, 65. Don't wait until thousands more have died, till you tell the truth with documents that reveal lies or crimes or internal projections of costs and dangers. You might save a war's worth of lives. You will also risk, despite the use of exposed fact, there's not riskless. We'll do the best to minimize the risks of exposure, and it should be done anonymously, in my opinion, unless you're prepared to go into exile like Edward Snowden. Should be done. You will risk prosecution under the Espionage Act, and you will, if that happens, you will not be able to argue any of your motives. So the risks are very great, but they're worth a war's worth of lives right now, and that's why I don't hesitate to ask people to consider doing that. Thank you.
So we have time for a few questions, and because this is being taped in full, we'll briefly summarize the questions. Anybody have a question you want to ask? Yes?
Yeah, Charlie Clark with Government Executive. Charlie Clark with Government Executive Media Group.